The third interlude of Derry. A bird came down the walk. He did not know I saw. He bit an angleworm in halves and ate the fellow raw. Emily Dickinson. A bird came down the walk. March 17th, 1985. The fire at the Black Spot happened in the late fall of 1930. So far as I am able to determine, the fire, the one my father barely escaped, ended the cycle of murder and disappearance which happened in the years 1929 to 30, just as the explosion at the ironworks ended a cycle some 25 years before. It is as if a monstrous sacrifice is needed at the end of the cycle to quiet whenever terrible forces it is which works here, to send it to sleep for another quarter century or so. But if such a sacrifice is needed to end each cycle, it seemed that some similar events is needed to set each cycle in motion. Which brings to the Bradley gang. Their execution took place at the freeway intersection of Canal Main of Kansi, not far, in fact, from the place shown in the picture, which began to move for Bill and Richie one day in June of 1958, some 13 months before the fire at the Black Spot in October of 1929, not long before the stock market crash. As with the fire at the Black Spot, many Derry residents, after not to remember what happened that day, or they were out of town visiting relatives, or they were napping that afternoon, or never found out what happened until they heard it on the radio news that night, or they will simply look you full in the face and lie to you. The police logs for that day indicated that Chef Sullivan was not even in town. Sure, I remember an Oliver Nell told me from a chair on the Sun Terrace on the Paulson Nursing Home in Bangor. That was my first year on the force, and I out to remember he was off in Western Maine bird hunting. They'd been cheated and carried off by the time he got back. Madder than a wet hen was Jim Sullivan, but a picture in a reference book on gangsters called Blood Letters and Badmen shows a grinning man standing beside the bullet-riddled corpse of Al Bradley in the morgue. And if that man is not Chef Sullivan, it is surely his twin brother. It was from Mr. Keene that I finally got what I believe to be the true version of the story. Norbert King, who was the proprietor of the Center Street drugstore from 1925 until 1975. He talked to me willingly enough, but like Betty Ripson's father, he made me turn off my tape record before he would really unwind the tale. Not that it mattered. I can hear his papery voice yet, another a capital singer, in the damned chore that in this town. No reason not to tell you, he said. No one will print it, and no one would believe it, even if they did. He offered me an old fashioned opportune jar, licorice whip, as I remember you were always particle to the red ones, Mikey. I took one with Chef Sullivan there that day. Mr. Keene laughed and took a licorice whip for himself. You wondered about that, did you? I wondered. I agreed, chewing a piece of the red licorice. I hadn't had one since I was a kid, shoving my pennies across the counter to much a younger and spear Mr. Keene. It tastes just as fine as it had back then. You're too young to remember when Bobby Thomson hit his home run for the Giants in the playoff game in 1951. Mr. Keene said, you wouldn't have been but 4 years old. Well, they ran an article about that game in the newspapers a few years after, and it seemed like just about 1 million folks from New York claimed they were there in the ballpark that day. Mr. King gummed his licorice whip, and a little dark drool ran over from the corner of his mouth. He wiped it off defenselessly with his handkerchief. We were sitting in the office between the drugstore because although Norbert Keene was 85 and retired 10 years, he still did the books for his grandson. Just the opposite when it comes to the Bradley gang. Keene examined. He was smiling, but it was not a pleasant smile. It was a cycle coldly reminiscent. There was the maybe 20,000 people who lived in downtown Derry back then. Main Street and Canal Street had both been paved for 4 years, but Canton Street was still dirt, raised dust in the summer, and turned into a bog hole every March and November. They used to oil up Mile Hill every June, and every 4th of July, the mayor would talk about how they were going to pave Canton Street. But it never happened until 1942. But what was I saying? 20,000 people who lived right downtown. I commented. Oh, ahaya. Well, of those 20,000, there's probably half that have passed away since, maybe even more. 50 years is a long time. And people have a funny way of dying young in Derry. Perhaps it is the air. But if those left, I don't think you'd find more than a dozen who'd say they were in downtown the day the Bradley gang went to Top Hat. Butch Roden over at the meat market would fez up to it. I guess he keeps a picture of one of the cars they had up on the wall where he cuts meat. Looking at that picture, you'd hardly know it was a car. Charlotte Littlefield would tell you a thing or two if you could get on her good side. She teaches over to the high school, and although I reckon she must not have been more than 10 or 12 at the time, I bet she remembers plenty. Carl Snow, Aubrey and Standerins, even Stampnell, and that old geezer who paints those funny pictures and drinks all night at Wally's Pickman. I think his name is. They'd remember. They were all there. He trailed off vigorously, looking at the licorice, whipped in his hand. I thought of prodding him and decided not to. At least, he said, most of the others would lie about it. The way people lied and said they were there when Bobby Thompson hit his homer. That's all I mean. But people lied about being at that ball game because they wished they had been there. People would lie to you about being in Derry that day because they wish they hadn't been. Do you understand me, Sonny? I nodded it. You sure you want to hear the rest of this? Mr. Keene asked me. You're looking a bit peaked, Mr. Mikey. I don't, I said, but I think I'd better all the same. Okay, Mr. Keene said mildly. It was my day for memories, as he offered me the apricot jar with the licorice whips in it. I suddenly remember a radio program my mother and dad used to listen to when I was just a little kid. Mr. Keene, Tracy of Lost Persons. Sheriff was there that day. All right, he was supposed to go bird hunting. But he changed his mind damn quick when Lau Machi came and told him that he was expecting Al Bradley that very afternoon. How did Machin know that? I asked. Well, that's an instructive tale in itself, Mr. Keene said, and the cycle smile creased his face again. Bradley was in never public enemy number one on the FBI's hit parade, but they had wanted him since 1928 or so, to show they could cut the mustard, I guess. Al Bradley and his brother, George, hit 6 or 7 banks across the Midwest and then kidnapped a banker for ransom. The ransom was paid $30,000, a big sum for those days. But they killed the banker anyway. By then, the Midwest had gotten a little toasty for the gangs that ran there. So Al and George and their litter of rattlins run northeast up this way. They rented themselves a big farmhouse just over the town line in Newport, not far from where the Ritalin farms are today. That was in the dog days of 29, maybe July, maybe August, maybe even early September. I don't know for sure. Just when there were 8 of them, Al Bradley, George Bradley, Joe Coughlin, and his brother Cal, an Irishman named Arthur Malloy, who was just called Creepy Jesus Malloy because he was nearsighted but wouldn't put on his specs unless he absolutely had to, and Patrick Codley, a young fellow from Chicago who is said to be killed crazy, but as handsome as Adianus. There were also 2 women with them, Kitty Donahue, George Bradley's common law wife and Marin Hossener, who belonged to Cody but sometimes got paused around according to the stories we all heard later. They made one bad ass mission when they got up here, Sawney. They got the idea they were so far away from Indiana that they were safe. They laid low for a while, and they got bored and decided they wanted to go hunting. They had plenty of firepower, but they were a bit low on ammunition. So they all came into Derry on the 7th of October in 2 cars. Patrick Cody took the woman around shopping, while the other men went into Machin's sporting goods. Kitty Donovan brought a dress and fleeces, and she died in it 2 days later. Law Machin waited on the man himself. He died in 1959. Too fat. He was always too fat. But there wasn't wrong with his eyes, and he knew it was Al Bradlin the minute he walked in. He said he recognized some of the others, but he wasn't sure of Malloy until he put on his specs to look at a display of knives in a glass case. Al Bradley walked up to him and said, "We'd like to buy some admission." "Well, Matchy says, you come to the right place." Bradley handed him a paper and Lau read it over. "The paper has been lost, at least so far as I know. But Lau said it would have turned your blood cold. They wanted 500 rounds of 38 caliber admission, 800 rounds of 45 caliber, 60 rounds of 50 caliber, which they don't even make anymore, shotgun shells loaded both with buck and bird, and 1,000 rounds each of .22 short and long rifle, plus, get this, 16,000 rounds of 45 machine gun bullets. Holy shit, I said. Mr. Keene smiled, that cyclone smile again, and offered me the appropriate jar. At first, I shook my head, and then I took another whip. "This here is quite a shopping list, boys," Lau says. "Come on, Al Creepin' Jesus," Malloy says. "I told you we wasn't going to get in a hick town like this. Let's go on up to Bangor. They won't have nothing there either, but I can use a ride." "Now hold your horses," Lau says, just as cool as a cucumber. "This here is one hell of a good order, and I wouldn't want to lose it to that Jew up Bangor. I can give you the 22s right now, also the bird and half the buck. I can give you 100 rounds, each of the 38 and 45 caliber too. I could have the rest for you." And here Lau short of half close his eyes and tap his chins, as if calculating it out by day after tomorrow. "How'd that be?" Bradley grinned like he'd split his head around the back and said it sounded just as fine as paint. Cal Coughlin said he'd still like to go on up to Bangor, but he was outvoted. "Now, if you're not sure you can make good on this order, you ought to say so right now." Al broadly says so to Al, "Because I'm a pretty fine fellow, but when I get mad, you don't want to get into a pissy contest with me. You follow?" "I do," Lau says, "and I'll have all the ammo you could want, Mr. Ratty," Bradley says. "Richard D. Raider, at your service." He stuck out his hand, and Lau pumped it, grinning all the while. "Real pleased, Mr. Raider." So then Bradley asked what would be a good time for him and his friends to drop by and pick up the goods. And Lau Machin asked them right back how 2 in the afternoon sounded to them. They agreed that would be fine. Out they went. Lau watched them go. They met the 2 women and Cody on the sidewalk outside. Lau recognized it. Cody, too. "So," Mr. Keene said, looking at me bright-eyed, "what do you think Lau done then?" "Called the cops." "I guess he didn't," I said, "based on what happened. Me, I would have broken my leg, get into the telephone." "Well, maybe you would, and maybe you wouldn't," Mr. Keene said with that same cycle, bright-eyed smile, and I shivered because I knew that he meant, and he knew I knew. Once something heavy begins to roll, It can't be stopped. It's simply going to roll until it finds a flat place long enough to wear away all of its forward motion. You can stand in front of that thing and get flattened, but that won't stop it either. Maybe you would have, and maybe you wouldn't, Mr. King repeated. But I can tell you what Lao Machin did the rest of that day and all of the next when someone he knew came in, some man, why he would tell them that he knew he had been out in the woods around the Newport Derry line shooting at deer and grouse and God knows what else with Kansas City typewriters. It was the Bradley gang. He knew for a fact because he had recognized them. He'd tell him that Bradley and his men were coming back the next day around 2 to pick up the rest of their order. He'd tell them, he'd promise Bradley all the ammunition he could want, and that was a promise he intended it to keep. How many? I asked. I felt hypnotized by glittering eye. Suddenly, the dry smell of his back room, the smell of prescription, drugs and powders, mustard roll, and Vicks Vapo rub and Rostinin cough syrup. Suddenly all those smells seemed suffocating, but I could no more have left then. I would kill myself by holding my breath. How many men did Lau pass the word to Mr. Keene asked. I nodded it. Don't know for sure, Mr. Keene said. Didn't stand right there and take up sentry duty. All those he felt he could trust, I suppose. Those he could trust. I mused. My voice was a little hoarse. Hi, Mr. Kane said. Derry men. You know, not that many of them raised cows. He laughed at this old joke before going on. I came in around 10 the day after the Bradleys first dropped in on Lau. He told me the story, then asked how he could help me. I'd only come in to see if my last roll of pictures had been developed in those days, match and handle on the Kodak films and cameras. But after I got my photos, I also said I could use some ammo for my Winchester. You gotta shoot some game, Norb. Lau asked me, passing over the shells. Might plung some ventments, I said, and we had us a chuckle over that. Mr. Keene laughed and slapped his skinny leg as if this was still the best joke he had ever heard. He leaned forward and tapped my knee. All I mean, son, is that the story got around all it needed to. Small towns, you know. If you tell the right people what you need to pass along, well, get along. See what I mean? Like another licorice whip. I took one with nub fingers. Make you fat, Mr. Keene said, and cackled. He looked old then, infinitely old, with his butterfollicles slipping down the gaunt blade of his nose, and the skin stretched too tight and thin across his cheeks to wrinkle. The next day, I brought my rifle into the store with me, and Bob Tanner, who worked harder than any assistants I ever had after him, brought in his pop's shotgun around 11 that day. Gregory Cole came in for a bib crab of soda, and damned if he didn't have a Colt .45 jammed right in his belt. Don't blow your balls off with that, Greg, I said. I come out of the woods all the way from Midford for this, and I got one fuck of a hangover, Greg said. I guess I'll blow someone's balls off before the sun goes down. Another 1:30, I put the little sign I had, be back soon, please be patient, in the door and took my rifle and walked out the back into Richard's alley. I asked Bob Tanner if he wanted to come along, and he said he'd better finish filling Mrs. Emerson's prescription, and he'd see me later, leave me a live one. Mr. Keeney said, but I allowed as how I couldn't promise nothing. There was hardly any traffic on Canal Street at all, either on foot or by car. Every now and then a delivery truck would pass, but that was about all. I saw Jake Pennant cross over, and he had a rifle in each hand. He met Andy Chris, and they walked over to one of the benches that used to stand where the war memorial was. You know, where the canal goes underground. Petey Venens and Al Nell and Jimmy Gordon were all sitting on the courthouse steps, eating sandwiches and fruit out of their dinner buckets, trading with each other for stuff that looked better to them, the way kids do on the schoolyard. They was all armed. Jimmy Gordon had himself a World War I Springfield that looked bigger than he did. I see a kid go walking toward up Mile Hill. I think maybe it was Zach Dipro, the father of your old buddy, the one who turned out to be a writer, and Kenny Borton says from the window of the Christian Science reading room. You want to get out of here, kid? There's going to be shooting. Zach took one look at his face and ran like hell. There were men everywhere. Men with guns, standing in doorways and sitting on steps and looking out of the window. Greg Cole was sitting in the doorway down the street with his .45 in his lap and about 24 shells lined up beside him like toys. Soldiers, Bruce Jagger Mayrer and that Sweden Olaf Firmostessens were standing underneath the Mayquay of the Bejoy in the shade. Mr. King looked at him through me. His eyes were not sharp now. They were hazy with memory, soft as the eyes of a man only become when he is remembering one of the best times of his life. The first home run he ever hit, maybe, or the first trout he ever landed that was big enough to keep, or the first time he ever lay with a willing woman. I remember I heard the wind, Sawney, he said dreamily. I remember hearing the wind and hearing the courthouse clock tall, too. Bob Tanner came up behind me, and I was so tight-wired I almost blew his head off. He only nodded at me and crossed over to Van Nox, dry goods trailing his shadow out behind him. You would have thought that when it got to 2:10 and nothing happened, then 2:15, then 2:20, folks would have just up and left, wouldn't you? But it didn't happen that way at all. People just kept their place because you knew they were going to come, didn't you? I asked. There was never any questions at all. He beamed at me like a teacher, pleased with us students. Ridiculous. That's right, he said. He knew no one had to talk about it. No one had to say, well, now, let's wait until 20 past. And if they don't show, I've got to get back to work. Things just stayed quiet. And around 2:25 that afternoon, these two cars, one red and one dark blue, started down up Mile Hill and came into the intersection. One of them was a Carvalot, and the other was a La Salle. The Coughlin brothers, Patrick Cotty and Maury Hosser, were in the Caver, and the Broadleys, Malloy and Kitty Donnan were in the La Salle. They started through the intersection okay, and then Al Broadley slammed on the brakes of that La Salle so sudden that Crotty damn near ran into him. The street was too quiet, and Broadley knew it. He wasn't nothing but an animal, but it doesn't make much to put up an animal's wind when it's been chased like a weasel in the corner for 4 years. He opened the door of the La Salle and stood up on the running board for a moment. He looked around, then he made a go-back gesture to Gaudy with his hand. Caudy said, "What, boss?" I heard that plain as day. The only thing I heard any of them say that day there was a wink of sun, too. I remember that. It came off a comeback mirror. The Hosser Human was powdering her nose. That was when La Martrin and his helper, Biff Marlowe, came running out of matching stores. "Put them up. Broadly, you're surrounded." La shouts, and before Broadly could do more than turn his head, La started blasting. He was wild at first, but then he put one into Broadly's shoulder. The claret started to pour out of that hole. Right away, Broadly caught hold of the La Salle's doorpost and swung himself back into the car. He threw it into gear, and that's when everyone started to shoot. It was all over in 4, maybe 5 minutes, but it seems a whole hell of a lot longer while it was happening. Petey and Al and Jimmy Gordon just sat there on the courthouse steps and poured bullets into the back end of the Chevrolet. I saw Bob Tanner down on one knee, firing and working the bolt on that old rifle of his like a madman. Jaggermarin and Firmicents were shooting into the right side of the La Salle from under the feeder, Macquit, and Greg Cole stood in the gutter holding that .45 automatic out in both hands, pulling the trigger just as fast as he could work it. There must have been 50, 60 men firing all at once after it was all over. La Machin dug 36 slugs out of the brick sides of his store, and that was 3 days later, after just about 20 every damn body in town who wanted one for a silver had come down and dug one out with his penknife. When it was at its worst, it sounded like the battle of a Marin. Windows were blown in by rifle fire all around Matchins. Bradley got the La Salle around in a half circle, and he wasn't slow, but by the time he done, he was running on 4 flats. Both the headlights were blown out, and the windscreen was gone. Creepin' Jesus Malloy and George Bradley were each at the back seat window firing pistols. I see one bullet take Malloy high up in the neck and tear it wide open. He shot twice more and then collapsed out the window with his arms hanging down. Cody tried to turn the Chaffalet and only ran into the back end of Bradley's La Sally. That was really the end of him. Right there, son, the Chalavrant's front bumper locked with the La Sallen's back one, and there went any chance they might have had to make a run for it. Joe Coughlin got out of the back seat and just stood there in the middle of the intersection, a pistol in each hand, and started to pour it on. He was shooting at Jake Petnett and Andy Chris. The two of them fell off the bench. They'd been sitting on a landing in the grass. Andy Chris shouted, I'm killed, over and over again, although he was never so much as touched. Neither of them were Joe Coughlin. He had time to fire both his guns empty before anything so much as touched him. His coat flew back, and his pants twitched like some woman you couldn't see was snitching on them. He was wearing a straw hat, and it flew off his head so you could see how he center parted his hair. He had one of his guns under his arm and was trying to reload the other when someone cut the legs out from under him, and he went down. Kenny Borton claimed him later, but there was really no way to tell. Couldn't have been anybody. Coughlin's brother Cal came out after him. Soon's Joan fell and down. He went like a ton of bricks with a hole in his head. Mary Hosser came out. Maybe she was trying to surrender. I don't know. She still had to compact. She'd been using to powder her nose in her right hand. She was screaming, I believe, but by then it was hard to hear. Bullets was flying all around them. That compact mirror was blow right out of her hand. She started back to the car. But she took one in the hip. She made it somehow and managed to crawl inside again. Al Bradley weaved the lost slop up just as high as it would go and managed to get it moving again. He dragged the Chalavrant maybe 10 feet before the bumper tore right off in it. The boys poured lead into it. All the windows was busted. One of the mud guards was laying in the streets. Malloy was dead, hanging out the window, but both of the Bradley brothers were still alive. George was firing from the back seat. His woman was dead beside him, with one of her eyes shot out. Al Broadley got to the big intersection. Then his auto mounted the curb and stopped there. He got out from behind the wheel and started running up Canal Street. He was riddled. Patrick Crotty got out of the Chevrolet, looked as if he was going to surrender for a minute. Then he grabbed a .38 from a cheater holster under his armpit. He triggered it off maybe 3 times, just firing wild, and then his shirt blew back from his chest in flames. He slid down the side of the Chevy until he was sitting on the running board. He shot one more time, and so far as I know, that was the only bullet that hit anyone. It ricocheted off something and then grazed across the back of Greg Cole's hand. Left a scar. He used to show off when he was drunk until someone, Al Nell, maybe took him aside and told him it might be a good idea to shut up about what happened to the Bradley gang. The Hosser woman came out, and that time wasn't any doubt. She was trying to surrender. She had her hands up. Maybe no one really meant to kill her, but by then there was a crossfire, and she walked right into it. George Bradley ran as far as that bench by the war Merle. Then someone pulped the back of his head with a shotgun blast. He fell down dead with his pants full of piss. Hardly aware I was doing it, I took a licorice whip from the jar. They went on pouring rounds into those cars for another minute or so before it began to taper off. Mr. Keene said, when men get their blood up, it doesn't go down easy. That was when I looked around and saw Sheriff Sullivan behind Nell and the other on the courthouse steps, putting rounds through that dead Chevy with a remnant pump. Don't let anyone tell you he hasn't there. Norbert Keene is sitting in front of you and telling you he was. By the time the firing stopped, those cars didn't look like cars at all. Anyone, just hunks of junk with glass around them. Men started to walk over to them. No one talked. All you could hear was the wind and feet grinning in over broken glass. That's when the pictures talking started it. And you ought to know this, Sonny, when the pictures talking streets starts, the story is over. Mr. Keene rocked in his chair, his slippers bumping practically on the floor, looking at me. There's nothing like that in the Derry News, was all I could think of to say. The headline of that day had read, State Police, FBI gun down, Bradley gang in pitched battle, with the subhead, Local Police led support. Course not, Mr. Keene said, laughing delightfully. I seen the publisher Mac laughing and put 2 round into Joe Coughlin himself. Christ, I muttered, get enough liquor, Sonny. I got enough. I said I licked my lips, Mr. Keene. How could a thing of that magnitude be covered up? Wasn't no cover up, he said, looking honestly surprised. It was just that no one talked about it much, and really, who cared? It wasn't President and Mrs. Hoover that went down that day. It was no worse than shooting mad dogs that would kill you with a bite if you give them half a chance. But the woman couple of whores, he said indefinitely. Besides, it happened in Derry, not in New York or Chicago. The place makes it news as much as what happened in the place, Sonny. That's why there was a bigger headlines when an earthquake kills 12 people in Los Angeles, and there was when one kills 3,000 in some Heffi's country in the Mid-East. Besides, it happened in Derry. I've heard it before, and I suppose if I continue to purpose this, I'll hear it again and again and again. They said it as it speak impatiently to a mental defense. They say it the way they would say it because of gravity. If you ask them how come you stick to the ground when you walk, they say it was as if there were a natural law any natural man should understand. And of course, the worst of that is I do understand. I had one more question for Norbert Keene. Did you see anyone at all that day that you didn't recognize once the shooting started? Mr. Keene's answer was quick enough to drop my blood temperature 10 degrees. Or so it felt. The clown, you mean? How did you find out about him, Sonny? Oh, I heard it somewhere, I said. I only caught a glimpse of him. Once things got hot, I tended pretty much to my own kittening. I glanced around just one and saw him up street. Beyond them, Swedes under the botchin' banquet, Mr. Keene said. He wasn't wearing a clown suit or nothing like that. He was dressed in a pair of farmer bee-balls and a cotton shirt underneath, but his face was covered with that white grease paint they use, and he had a big red clown smile painted on. Also had these tufts of fake hair, orange sorta comical. Law Marchand never saw that fellow, but Biff did. Only Biff must have been confused, because he thought he saw him in one of the windows of an apartment over somewhere to the left. And once, when I asked Jimmy Gordon, he was killed in Pearl Harbor, went down with his ships, the California. I think it was, he said he saw the guy behind the war Myrtle. Mr. Keene shook his head, smiling a little. It's funny how people get during a think like that. And even funnier what they remembered after it's all over. You can listen to 16 different tales and know 2 of them while jibed together. Take the gun that clown fellow had, for instance. Gun? I asked. He was shooting too. Yeah, Mr. Keene said. The one glimpse I caught of him, it looked like he had a Witchener bolt action, and it wasn't until later that I figured out I must have thought that because that's what I had. Biff Marlowe thought he had a premonition because that was what he had. And when I asked Jimmy about it, he said that guy was shooting in Old Springfield. Just like this. Funny, huh? Funny, I managed, Mr. King. Didn't any of you wonder what in the hell a clown, especially when in Farmer's bin balls, was doing just then? Sure, Mr. Keene said. It wasn't no big deal. You understand, but sure we wondered. Most of us figured was somebody who wanted to attend the party but didn't want to be recognized. A town council member, maybe Horst Muller, maybe or even Trace Nagler, who wasn't mayor back then. Or it could just have been a professional man who didn't want to be recognized. A doctor or a lawyer. I would have recognized my own father in a get-up like that. He laughed a little and asked him what was funny. There's also a possibility that it was a real clown, he said. Back in the 20s and 30s, the country fair in Eastie came a lot earlier than it does now. And it was set up and going full blast the week that the Bradley gang that met their end. There was clowns at the country fair. Maybe one of them heard we were going to have over our own little carnival and rowed down because he wanted to be in on it. He smiled at me dryly. I'm about talked about it, he said. But I'll tell you one more thing since you appeared to me so interesting and you listened to so close. It was something Biff Marlowe said about 16 years later when we were having a few beers up to pilots in Bangor. Right out of a clear blue sky, he said it was said that clown was leaning out of the window so far that Biff couldn't believe he wasn't falling. It wasn't just his head and shoulders and arms that was out, Biff said. He was right out to the knees, hanging there in mid-air, shooting down at the cars. The Bradleys had come in with their big red grin on his face. He was tricked out like a jack-o'-lantern. That he had a bad scare was how Biff would put it. Like he was floating, I said. Yeah, Mr. Keene agreed. And Biff said there was something else, something that bothered him for weeks afterward. One of those things you get right on the tip of your tongue, but won't quite come off, or something that lights on your skin, like a mosquito or a nostril. He said he finally figured out what it was one night when he had to get up and tap a kidney. He stood there, whizzing into the bowl, thinking of nothing in particular, when it come to him all at once that it was 2:25 in the afternoon when the shooting started and the sun was out, but that clown didn't cast any shadow. No shadow at all. Oh.